Get out and never come back. You are nothing to this family." My mother's scream tore through the high ceilings of the historic brownstone I secretly paid for. Ethan stood behind her, smirking, his $50,000 gambling debt, the invisible elephant in the room. I did not beg. I did not cry. I looked at Susan, then at the brother I had subsidized for a decade. "Understood," I said. My voice was flat, clinical. I grabbed my bag, walked out the heavy oak door, and let the biting Chicago wind hit my face. The lock clicked shut behind me. Final. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the engine humming quietly against the Chicago freeze. My hands were on the wheel, 10 and 2, perfectly steady. The porch light of the brownstone was still on, casting a yellow glow on the snow. I waited for the grief to hit. I waited for the tears, the panic, the urge to run back and beg for forgiveness. But nothing came. Instead, the temperature in my chest dropped to match the air outside. It was a strange, clarifying cold. For the first time in 29 years, the fog of obligation lifted, and I saw the equation for what it really was. I wasn't a daughter being punished. I was a vendor whose contract had just been terminated. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen was bright in the dark cabin. Face ID unlocked it instantly. I didn't open my messages. I didn't open my contacts. I went straight to my banking app. The blue logo pulsed, then loaded my dashboard. I scrolled past my checking, past my savings, down to the scheduled transfers tab. There it was. The heartbeat of my family's lifestyle, labeled simply as family support, $3,850. Scheduled for the first of every month. I stared at the number. $3,850. That wasn't just a mortgage payment. That was a luxury subscription. That was the price of admission to a club that had just revoked my membership. For a decade, I had treated this transfer like a fixed cost, as non-negotiable as gravity. I had built my entire financial life around the absence of this money. I worked 60-hour weeks managing global supply chains, optimizing routes, cutting inefficiencies for billion-dollar companies, yet I had allowed this massive bleeding inefficiency to exist in my own personal ledger. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Get out. A direct order. In logistics, when a client refuses a shipment, you don't force it on them. You return to sender. You liquidate the inventory. You cut your losses. They wanted me out of their lives, fine. Then they wanted my money out of their lives too. You cannot evict the tenant and keep the rent check. I tapped the transfer line. The details expanded. Next payment due in 4 days. I hit the button that said Edit. Then I hit Cancel Series. The app threw up a warning, a little gray box asking if I was sure I wanted to delete this recurring transaction. I didn't blink. I didn't hesitate. My thumb hovered for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt but out of recognition. This was the most expensive click of my life. Confirm. The line item vanished. The screen refreshed. The balance projection for next month instantly jumped up by nearly $4,000. It was a staggering visual. That money was mine now. It wasn't going to the historic brownstone. It wasn't going to Susan's image or Ethan's bail money. It was staying right here. I didn't send a text to warn them. I didn't send a dramatic farewell email explaining my actions. That would be emotional. That would be an invitation for negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating. I was executing a severance package. I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the curb. The rearview mirror went dark. The transaction was complete. I checked into a hotel downtown, a sleek high-rise with anonymous gray carpets and blackout curtains. I didn't unpack. I just sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. I needed to see the numbers. In my line of work, you don't make decisions based on feelings. You make them based on data, and the data of my life was a financial crime scene. My tax returns show that I am a senior logistics manager earning $145,000 a year. I manage supply chains for medical equipment. I solve complex high-stakes puzzles before most people have had their morning coffee. Yet looking at my personal checking account, you would think I was a grad student living on a stipend. My apartment, the one I just walked away from, was a 400-square-foot studio with second-hand furniture and drafty windows. I drove a 6-year-old sedan. I clipped coupons. I lived on a strict austerity budget. Why? Because for the last 4 years I had been the sole liquidity provider for a failing enterprise known as the Evans family brownstone. The brownstone was a 4-story monument to my parents' vanity. Susan and Thomas didn't live in it, they performed in it. They hosted dinner parties they couldn't afford to impress people they didn't like. And Ethan lived in the garden suite, a glorified term for the basement rent-free. He was 33 years old. He spent his days incubating tech startups that never launched and his nights gambling away the seed money. They protected him like a rare asset while they treated me like a renewable resource. People ask why I did it, why I handed over nearly $4,000 a month while my own life remained small and cramped. It's easy to call it weakness. It's easy to say I was a doormat, but that's a lazy analysis. In logistics, we call it legacy system integration. You don't realize the system is broken when you're built inside the machine. It's the boiling frog effect applied to human psychology. They didn't ask for $3,000 on day one. It started when I was 10, fetching Susan's wine, because she was too stressed. It evolved when I was 16 working retail to pay for my own school clothes because Thomas had cash flow issues. They groomed me. They conditioned me to believe that my worth was directly tied to my utility. If I was useful, I was safe. If I was providing, I was good. Love wasn't an emotion in our house. It was a transaction, and I was the one paying the invoice. I had normalized the cruelty. I had accepted that my role was to be the fuel they burned to keep Ethan warm. But tonight the heat had finally spiked too high. The frog didn't just jump. The frog shut down the entire heating element. I looked at the spreadsheet on my screen. The silent investor column was empty for the first time in 48 months. I wasn't just saving money. I was reclaiming my own existence. They wanted the brownstone fine. They wanted the image of wealth fine. But they had forgotten the most basic rule of business: you do not fire the only person who is keeping the lights on. I closed the laptop. The silence in the hotel room was expensive, costing me $200 a night. It was the first thing I had bought for myself in years, and it was worth every penny. Ethan is 33 years old. While I spent my 20s climbing the corporate ladder, earning certifications and negotiating contracts, Ethan spent his finding himself in the garden level of the brownstone. He calls himself an entrepreneur. He has business cards that say CEO of companies that don't have websites, tax IDs, or revenue. One year it was a crypto mining operation that only succeeded in tripling the electric bill which I paid. The next, it was a luxury drop shipping brand that ended with a garage full of unsold inventory, which I paid to have hauled away. My parents didn't see a failure, they saw a misunderstood genius. To Susan and Thomas, Ethan was the golden asset that just needed one more round of funding to go public. I was the diversified bond, boring, reliable, there to provide the stability while they gambled on the volatile stock. They protected his ego with a ferocity they never applied to my well-being. If I worked late, I was a workaholic. If Ethan slept until noon, he was working on a different time zone. The argument that ended my tenancy wasn't about dirty dishes or a missed curfew. It was about liquidity. Ethan had gotten into something messy. Online poker, sports betting, a sure thing that went south. He needed $50,000 to make a problem go away before it became a legal issue. Susan had put the demand on the table like a dinner plate. You have the money, Vanessa. Fix this for your brother. For the first time in my life, I looked at the ledger and said no. I told them that bailouts were for distressed assets with potential, not black holes. That's when the screaming started. That's when my mother decided that if I wasn't going to be the bank, I wasn't welcome in the vault. They evicted me to punish me, confident that the threat of exile would force me to open my checkbook. They miscalculated my risk tolerance. The silence lasted 30 days. I moved from the hotel into a one-bedroom apartment in a glass high-rise 3 miles south. It was everything the brownstone wasn't. Modern, efficient, sterile. I bought furniture that I chose, not antiques Susan insisted we preserve. I bought a coffee maker that cost $300 and didn't feel a shred of guilt. Every morning I woke up, looked at the lake, and waited for my phone to ring. But it didn't. Day 5 passed, day 10, day 20. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't mysterious. I knew exactly why they hadn't called. In their minds, the transaction was still processing. They assumed that, even though they had thrown me out, the autopay was still active. They believed my desperation for their approval was a fixed contract term that couldn't be broken. They were sitting in their warm, historic home, waiting for the first of the month, secure in the knowledge that the silent investor would keep the lights on. They didn't know I had already liquidated the account. I wasn't hiding. I was just waiting for the invoice to bounce. Day 45. That is the magic number in mortgage logistics. The bank gives you a 15-day grace period. Then they send a polite letter. Then a stern letter. And then on day 45 the delinquency becomes official and the phone calls begin. I knew the timeline better than I knew my own birthday because I had spent 4 years ensuring we never hit that marker. But this morning I was sitting in my office reviewing a shipping manifest for MRI machines when my personal phone lit up. It was Thomas. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring 4 times, finishing my email. When I finally swiped accept, there was no hello. There was only the sound of a man who had lost control of his narrative. "What did you do?" he screamed. His voice cracked high and thin. "The bank just called. The mortgage bounced. They're saying we're delinquent. You're trying to ruin us, Vanessa. You're trying to destroy this family." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the city skyline. "I didn't do anything, Thomas," I said, my voice steady. "I simply stopped paying for a house I was evicted from. You told me to leave. I left. My money left with me." "That was a heat-of-the-moment thing," he shouted. "We were fighting, families fight, but you have a duty. You have an obligation. You can't just cut off the mortgage. That money is for the estate. It's for the legacy." He was gaslighting me in real time, trying to separate the abuse from the bill. He genuinely believed that my eviction was an emotional event, but my financial contribution was a contractual obligation that survived the termination of the relationship. Listening to him panic, I finally understood the mechanism at work. It wasn't just favoritism, it was economics. Specifically, the sunk cost fallacy. In business, the sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue throwing good money after bad because you have already invested so much that you cannot bear to admit the loss. My parents had spent 33 years investing in Ethan. They had poured their ego, their identity, and their reputation into the idea that their son was a genius entrepreneur. To hold him accountable now, to demand he get a job or pay rent, would be to admit that their entire investment strategy was a failure. It would destroy their own self-image. They couldn't fold the hand on Ethan, so they needed me to be the liquidity injection. I was the fresh capital keeping a bankrupt venture afloat. They weren't protecting him because they loved him more. They were protecting him because admitting he was a liability would mean admitting they were bad investors. They would rather burn me, the profitable asset, than admit the golden child was a loss. "I am not your legacy insurance," I said into the phone. "And I am not paying for a house where I am not welcome. If you need money, ask the person living in the garden suite." "Ethan is building something," Thomas sputtered. "He just needs time." "You are selfish, Vanessa. You are cold. If we lose this house, it is on your head." "No," I corrected him. "It's on the deed, which doesn't have my name on it." I hung up. It was filled with the realization that they would truly rather lose everything than ask their son to pay a single dollar. They were committed to the crash. I didn't scream back. I didn't try to outshout a man who was drowning in his own panic. In my world, when a vendor fails to deliver, you don't argue with the sales rep. You audit the books. I told Thomas I would look into the account history, and I hung up. My voice was calm, the kind of calm that precedes a massive corporate restructuring. I opened my laptop. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment. This was the point of no return. I logged into the joint checking account, the operational account I had funded for 4 years. I still had the login credentials, a remnant of the days when I was expected to troubleshoot their technical issues because they weren't good with computers. The dashboard loaded. The balance was negative $200. I pulled up the transaction history for the last 10 months. I needed to trace the flow of capital. I knew my output, $4,500 a month. That was the agreed-upon sum, $3,850 for the mortgage, plus a surplus for property taxes and maintenance. It was a generous operating budget. The mortgage should have been on autopay. The math should have been simple. But the ledger told a different story. I filtered the search. The mortgage payments had been sporadic for a year, then stopped completely 10 months ago. But I had kept sending the money. So where did $45,000 go? It hadn't evaporated. Money never disappears. It just changes hands. I scrolled through the withdrawals looking for the leak. I found it. It wasn't a leak. It was a fire hose. Starting 10 months ago, there were recurring transfers to Ethan Evans. 500 here, 1,000 there. But those were small potatoes compared to the line item that made my blood run cold. A massive down payment of $12,000 to Lakeshore Luxury Auto, followed by monthly payments of $900. I clicked on the check image for the down payment. In the memo line in my father's shaky handwriting were the words, company vehicle, investment. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, dark and jagged. It wasn't a company vehicle. Ethan didn't have a company. He didn't have clients. He didn't have a commute. I did a quick search on the dealership's inventory and cross-referenced the payment amount. It matched the financing terms for a fully loaded obsidian black luxury pickup truck, a $65,000 toy for a man who lived in a basement. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just mismanaged the money. They hadn't just fallen behind because groceries were expensive. Thomas had taken the money I sent to save their home, the money I earned working 60-hour weeks, and he had diverted it to buy Ethan a status symbol. He had embezzled the mortgage payments to fund his son's cosplay as a successful businessman. They deemed the truck more essential than the roof over their heads. They gambled that I would never check the books, or that if I did, I would simply pay off the mortgage anyway to avoid the shame of foreclosure. They had stripped the equity from their own future to polish the ego of their golden child. This wasn't negligence. This was theft. And I had the receipts. The foreclosure notice arrived at the brownstone exactly 30 days after my audit. I know this because the bank also sent a copy to my old email address, a courtesy for the former financial contact. It was a formal eviction warning. They had 30 days to vacate. The legacy they claimed to protect was being liquidated. I didn't call to gloat. I didn't call to offer a lifeline. I just waited. 3 days later, security at my office building called my desk. Miss Evans, there are 2 individuals in the lobby asking for you. They say they're your parents. They're upset. I told the guard to let them wait. I finished my coffee. I reviewed a contract for a shipment of surgical steel. Then I took the elevator down. The lobby of my building is a cavern of marble and glass designed to make visitors feel small. Susan and Thomas looked microscopic. They were huddled on a leather bench looking older than I had ever seen them. Susan was weeping into a tissue. Thomas was pale, his hands shaking in his lap. They weren't the imperious landlords who had screamed at me to get out. They were refugees of their own financial disaster. When they saw me, they scrambled up. Susan tried to rush forward, arms open, aiming for a hug that would erase the last 2 months. I stepped back. Professional distance. Vanessa, she sobbed. Thank God. You have to help us. We're losing the legacy. We're losing the brownstone. We can't let strangers take our home, Thomas added, his voice trembling. For the sake of the family. For your brother. Please. Just pay the arrears. We'll make it right. They were still doing it. Even at the edge of the cliff, they were asking me to be the parachute for Ethan. They weren't sorry. They were just broke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture them about responsibility. I simply opened the manila folder I had brought down with me. You aren't losing the house because of me, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet lobby. And you aren't losing it because of bad luck. I handed Thomas the paper. It wasn't a check. It was a printout of the transaction history I had uncovered. Highlighted in neon yellow was the wire transfer to Lakeshore Luxury Auto, $65,000. The exact amount of equity they needed to save their home sitting on 4 rubber tires in the driveway. You embezzled my mortgage payments, I said. You took the money I sent to keep a roof over your heads and you bought Ethan a truck for a business that doesn't exist. You didn't prioritize the legacy. You prioritized his ego. Thomas stared at the paper. His face turned a shade of gray that matched the stone floor. Susan stopped crying and froze. They looked at the evidence of their own theft, stripped of all the family rhetoric they used to hide it. I can't save you, I said, stepping back toward the security gates. Because I don't have that money anymore. Ethan has it. Maybe he can sell the truck. Vanessa, wait, Susan wailed, realizing the meeting was over. I turned back one last time. You told me to get out. I did. Now you have to get out too. I swiped my badge. The glass gates opened. I walked through them and didn't look back. The foreclosure auction took place 90 days after I walked out of the lobby. I didn't attend. I didn't need to see the gavel fall to know the asset had been liquidated. The brownstone sold for just enough to cover the bank's lien and the outstanding tax bill. There was no equity left over. My parents moved into a 2-bedroom rental apartment in a suburb 45 minutes away. It has low ceilings, laminate countertops, and thin walls. They hate it. Ethan's luxury truck was repossessed 3 weeks later. Without the embezzled funds from the mortgage account, he couldn't make a single payment. He is back to taking the bus. The CEO is now working part-time at a warehouse, a job Thomas forced him to take to pay their new rent. The reality check was brutal, but it was necessary. I haven't spoken to them since that day in the lobby. I blocked their numbers, their emails, and their social media accounts. I didn't do it to punish them. I did it to protect the new ecosystem I was building. There is a misconception about going no contact. People tell you it is an act of war. They tell you that you are cold, that you are unforgiving, that family is the most important asset you possess. But they are wrong. Family is a system, and sometimes that system is designed to consume you. If you are standing on that edge right now, wondering if you are too harsh for walking away, listen to me. You are not losing a family. You are surviving one. You are not abandoning them. You are saving yourself. The guilt you feel is just the programming they installed to keep you compliant. It is the error code they wrote into your software to stop you from uninstalling the malware. Peace is expensive. It cost me a historic home. It cost me the illusion of having parents who loved me. It cost me the comfort of the familiar. But as I sit here in my own apartment drinking coffee that I paid for, looking out at a view that belongs only to me, I look at the balance sheet of my life. I have silence. I have dignity. I have a future that isn't being mortgaged to pay for someone else's mistakes. Peace is expensive, but looking at the ledger now, I can tell you this, it is worth every single penny. If you've ever had to pay the price for your own peace, share this story. You aren't alone.